Do strangers know more about your private life than you ever agreed to share? Hundreds of millions of people trust Siri with everyday requests, quick questions, and deeply personal moments. But for years, many of those devices were quietly capturing short audio clips and routing them far beyond Apple's servers into the hands of human listeners spread across the globe. This was not a breach, it was not malware, and it was not an accident. It was part of an internal quality control system Apple never clearly explained to users. A program designed to review Siri interactions, including those triggered unintentionally when the assistant misheard a wake phrase or activated on its own. What later emerged shocked even longtime Apple customers. Whistleblowers revealed that contractors were listening to recordings of private conversations that were never meant for any assistant at all. Intimate moments between couples, confidential medical discussions, business negotiations, even conversations involving illegal activity, all captured when Siri activated by mistake, all reviewed by real people. Apple eventually agreed to a major settlement tied to these practices. But the larger question remains unresolved. How much did users actually consent to? And how much was quietly assumed? This video breaks down what Apple knew about Siri recordings, how the human review process really worked, and why the changes Apple made afterward still leave serious privacy concerns unresolved. Once you understand how this system operated, it becomes very difficult to think about your iPhone in the same way. When Apple introduced Siri, it was marketed as a helpful personal assistant built with privacy at its core. The message was clear. Siri would only listen when you asked it to. Your voice data would be anonymized, and any information collected would be handled responsibly. Hands-free activation made Siri more convenient. You could speak without touching your phone while driving, cooking, or multitasking. Apple described this as a usability improvement, not a surveillance risk. According to Apple's public explanations, Siri recordings were collected to improve accuracy and performance. The company said these samples were stripped of identifying information and used only for quality improvement. What Apple did not clearly communicate was that humans would be involved at all. Behind the scenes, a program internally referred to as grading assigned contractors to review massive volumes of Siri audio. And these reviewers listened to short clips to determine whether Siri had been triggered correctly or activated by mistake. The work was outsourced to third-party firms, and reviewers were expected to process thousands of recordings during a single shift. Many of those recordings contained sensitive information that users never intended to share with any system, human or automated. When this reality became public, it shattered Apple's carefully cultivated privacy narrative. The issue was not just that audio was collected, it was that deeply personal moments were reviewed by strangers, without clear consent, and without users fully understanding the scope of what was happening. Apple later adjusted its policies and settings, allowing users to opt out of audio review and limiting human access. But critics argue the changes came only after public exposure, not proactive transparency. The core issue remains trust. When a device sits in your pocket, on your nightstand, or in your home, listening for a wake word, the boundary between convenience and intrusion becomes razor thin. And when that boundary is crossed without clear disclosure, the damage is not just technical, it is personal. Understanding how Siri recordings were handled is not about fear, it is about informed choice. And once that choice is fully understood, many users begin asking a much harder question. Who is really listening and who decides when that is acceptable? Most clips were just a few seconds long, but regularly, workers heard far more than simple voice commands. The whistleblower described listening to confidential medical information, drug deals, recordings of couples engaged in sexual activity, and private business discussions. Each recording came with metadata that could include location data, contact details, and information about which apps were in use at the time. While Apple claimed recordings were anonymized and not connected to individual user IDs, the metadata often made it possible to identify people or understand sensitive context. The core problem was accidental activation. Siri was frequently triggered without any deliberate user action. Sounds that resembled "Hey Siri," phrases like "Hey Sarah," or even the rustling of fabric near the device could wake the assistant. When this happened, Siri would begin recording whatever conversation or activity was taking place nearby, treating it as if the user had intentionally asked a question. Apple sent approximately 1% of all Siri interactions to contractors for grading, which sounds small until you consider the scale. With hundreds of millions of Siri-enabled devices in use, that 1% represented millions of recordings containing deeply personal moments. You probably think the biggest risk here is someone physically stealing your phone and accessing your data. But the threat goes far deeper than that. Once these recordings left your device and reached Apple servers, they passed through the hands of contract workers employed by third-party companies across multiple countries. These were not Apple employees bound by the company internal security protocols. They were temporary staff with access to some of the most intimate data you can imagine. Security researchers and privacy advocates pointed out that even if recordings were technically anonymized, The combination of audio content, metadata, and context made de-anonymization straightforward in many cases. A recording that includes someone saying an address, a phone number, or a name, paired with location metadata, is not truly anonymous. Beyond contractor access, there was also the question of data retention and security. If these recordings were stored on Apple servers, even temporarily, they became potential targets for data breaches or subpoenas. And for users, there was no way to know whether a recording had been flagged for grading, no notification that a human had listened to it, and no option to delete it or opt out of the process. The fallout from the Guardian investigation was immediate. Privacy regulators in Europe began scrutinizing whether Apple practices violated the General Data Protection Regulation, which requires explicit, informed consent for processing personal data. The GDPR also mandates that companies minimize data collection and provide clear transparency about how data is used, principles Apple grading program appeared to violate. In France, the the organization Ligue des Droits de l'Homme filed a formal complaint in 2025 alleging that Apple engaged in unauthorized surveillance by recording and storing private conversations without explicit user approval. Whistleblower Thomas Labanik, the former contractor who helped expose the program, emphasized that users had no idea their conversations were being recorded and transcribed, much less reviewed by human workers. Digital rights groups worldwide called Apple practices a fundamental breach of trust. The company had built its brand on privacy, famously running advertising campaigns that proclaimed, "What happens on your iPhone stays on your iPhone." But the Siri grading scandal revealed that some of the most sensitive things happening on your iPhone were, in fact, being sent to strangers overseas. The disconnect between Apple marketing and its actual data practices fueled anger among users and advocates alike. While no major fines have been publicly levied as of early 2025, the regulatory pressure contributed to Apple's decision to overhaul the program and ultimately settle the class action lawsuit filed in the United States. Imagine you are a journalist who uses Siri to set reminders or send messages while working on a story involving confidential sources. Siri activates accidentally while you are on a phone call discussing sensitive details. That recording, complete with metadata showing your location and contacts, gets flagged for grading and reviewed by a contractor halfway around the world. Your source identity and the story you are working on are now potentially compromised. Consider a survivor of domestic violence who has left an abusive partner and is staying at a confidential shelter. They use their iPhone to navigate or check the weather using Siri. An accidental activation captures them speaking to a counselor about their new address. If that recording includes location metadata, it could theoretically expose their safe location to anyone with access to Apple grading program data. Or think about a therapist who uses an iPad during sessions to take notes or set appointment reminders. Siri triggers during a session, recording fragments of a patient disclosure about trauma, medical history, or suicidal thoughts. That recording, even if anonymized, now exists on a server and has been heard by a contractor who has no legal or ethical obligation to protect patient confidentiality. These scenarios are not based on named real-world victims, but they represent the exact categories of risk that security experts and privacy advocates warned about. Health information, legal matters, and personal safety are all areas where accidental recording can cause real harm. The grading program operated for years without users knowing their most private moments might be captured and reviewed by strangers. After the July 2019 Guardian report, Apple immediately suspended the Siri grading program worldwide. The company issued a statement saying it would conduct a thorough review of its practices and pledged to make changes. In August 2019, Apple announced its new approach. First, Apple said it would no longer retain audio recordings of Siri interactions by default, instead relying on computer-generated transcripts to improve the service. Second, the company introduced an opt-in system. Users who wanted to help improve Siri could choose to allow their audio samples to be reviewed, and only by Apple employees, not third-party contractors. Apple also laid off over 300 contract workers in Europe who had been performing grading tasks. These changes were significant and addressed some of the most glaring problems. But critical vulnerabilities remain. Apple still collects and processes Siri data, and while opt-in protects users who read the fine print, many people accept default settings without understanding what they are agreeing to. More importantly, the underlying technical issue, accidental activation, was never fully solved. Users still report that Siri triggers randomly during conversations, when moving their device, or when background noise resembles the wake word. Each accidental activation is still a potential privacy breach, even if the recording is now processed by an Apple employee instead of a contractor. And while Apple claims recordings are not retained by default, users who do opt in are still trusting the company to handle that data securely. The protection of that data relies on Apple internal security, not on fundamental changes to how Siri listens and activates. In essence, Apple shifted from a system with very poor privacy protections to one with moderate protections, but the core architectural risk, a device that is always listening and can misinterpret ambient sound as a command, remains in place. If you own any Siri-enabled Apple device, you can take immediate steps to limit your exposure. Go to Settings, then tap on Siri and search. You will see an option labeled Listen for Hey Siri. Turn this off if you want to prevent accidental voice activations. You can still use Siri by pressing the side button or home button manually when you need it, but the assistant will no longer be passively listening for the wake phrase. Next, scroll down to the option called Siri and Dictation History and review whether Apple has stored any of your interactions. You can delete this history at any time by tapping Delete Siri and Dictation History at the bottom of that screen. If you want to ensure Apple is not using your Siri recordings to improve its services, go back to the main Siri settings screen and look for Improve Siri and Dictation. Make sure this is turned off. This ensures that even if you use Siri, your audio will not be sent to Apple for analysis. For users who want even more control, consider disabling Siri entirely on sensitive devices like work laptops or tablets using confidential settings. You can do this by toggling off all Siri options in the Siri and Search settings menu. While this removes the convenience of voice assistants, it eliminates the risk of accidental recording altogether. Finally, review app permissions for microphone access by going to Settings, then Privacy and Security, then Microphone. Make sure only trusted apps have access, and revoke permissions for apps you do not actively use. These steps will not make your device invincible, but they significantly reduce the chance that your private conversations will be captured and stored without your knowledge. Your operating system does not just work for you anymore, it works for the company that made it, collecting data, learning your habits, and making decisions about your privacy on your behalf. The Siri grading scandal proved that even companies that market themselves as privacy champions can violate that trust when it serves their business goals. Right now, you have two choices. First, you can go into your settings and turn off Hey Siri, Improve Siri, and Dictation to take back control of what your device is listening to. Second, you can share this video with someone you know who uses an iPhone, iPad, or any other Apple device, because chances are they have no idea this ever happened. Leave a comment below and tell me which option you chose. Did you change your settings? Or are you sharing this with someone who needs to know? Either way, you are taking a stand for your privacy. If you want to see the next investigation into how tech companies are tracking you without permission, subscribe now so you do not miss it. Your device is listening. The question is, who is really on the other end?